The town of Dust Haven had a way of swallowing hope. The wind carried dust like a curse, scouring every surface until wood warped, iron rusted, and men's tempers grew short. In the summer of 1876, the sun seemed hotter than any year before, baking the boards of the town's single street until boots struck them with hollow, angry echoes. That day, folks gathered in the square as though for a fair. They didn't come for ribbons or pie contests. They came for the auction. Not cattle, not horses, people. It was a cruel business born of desperation. Widows with no kin, women with no means, sometimes even orphans too young to fend for themselves were offered to men willing to provide food and shelter in exchange for their labor, or worse, obedience. Some called it mercy. Others called it ownership. Most folks kept quiet, for it was easier to look away from ugliness when their own bellies were full. Clara Hayes stood on the platform, her body trembling though she tried to keep her back straight. She was only 26, yet the grief of the last year had stolen the glow of her youth. Her bonnet was faded, her dress torn at the hem, and her hands clenched into fists inside worn gloves. She had once been the wife of a modest farmer, content in a life of hard work and laughter. But her husband, Daniel, had been killed when a runaway wagon crushed him against a barn wall. In a single day, the world had shifted from warm and safe to cold and merciless. The land they had worked was seized by creditors. Neighbors who had shared supper at her table suddenly turned their faces away. By winter's end, she was starving, scavenging scraps. A sheriff's deputy finally told her she had two choices: beg along the street until she wasted away, or step onto the platform and let some man take responsibility for her. Now here she stood, her chin trembling as the auctioneer, a short, heavy man with whiskey on his breath, announced her as if she were a mule. Next up, Clara Hayes. Strong enough for housework, not too old. She'll keep a home tidy. Who'll start the bidding? The crowd muttered. Some men chuckled, whispering comments loud enough to sting. Clara shut her eyes for a heartbeat, praying someone kind might step forward, though her prayers had gone unanswered for months. $2, shouted a ranch hand with a cruel smirk. Laughter followed. 3, barked another, elbowing his friend. They weren't bidding for her worth. They were bidding for sport. Clara swallowed hard, shame burning her cheeks. She thought of running, but where would she go? Beyond the town stretched nothing but desert and scrub. Alone, she would last days at best. Then the murmurs hushed. A shadow moved from the edge of the crowd. He was taller than most, broad in the shoulders, the kind of man who seemed carved from the land itself. His shirt clung to muscles earned through labor, not vanity, and his hat shaded a face both stern and steady. A scar crossed one brow, but his eyes, clear, gray, and unyielding, seemed to silence even the boldest heckler. Luke Merritt. Some recognized him instantly. He owned a ranch beyond the northern hills, land that stretched farther than most men could ride in a day. He lived alone, though rumors swirled. Some said he'd lost his family to fever, others that he'd left them behind. What was true, few knew. Luke didn't step close to the platform like the others. He simply raised his hand, his voice calm but cutting through the noise. I'll take her. No bid, no number, just a declaration. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off balance. Well, she's worth at least 5. Luke's gaze hardened, and the man swallowed his words. Very well. Sold. The hammer struck. Just like that, Clara's fate was sealed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cursed under their breath. Others jeered. Figures Merritt would pick one up, someone muttered. Bet she'll regret it, another sneered. Clara's knees threatened to buckle as the auctioneer ushered her down from the platform. She gripped the rail to steady herself. Luke was waiting at the bottom, towering above the others. For a terrifying moment, she expected him to grab her, to claim her like property. Instead, he tipped his hat. Ma'am. One simple word, spoken with respect she hadn't heard in months. Clara blinked, uncertain. You're taking me? Luke nodded once. If you'll come. It was not a command. It was an invitation. Behind them, laughter rose again, but Luke ignored it. He reached for her bundle of belongings. Hardly more than a threadbare shawl, and a small Bible, and carried it himself. His hand, calloused and scarred, dwarfed the little bundle, but he held it with surprising care. The sheriff watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, perhaps wondering if he had just witnessed something unusual. In Dust Haven, kindness was rare. As Luke led Clara toward his wagon, the crowd parted like water around a stone. Some glared, others spat in the dirt, but none dared challenge him. His presence was command enough. Clara followed, each step heavy with fear and strange relief. She had no idea what awaited her at his ranch, safety or another cage, but one thing was certain. Her life had changed forever the moment he lifted his hand. And as the wagon rolled away from Dust Haven, the townsfolk whispered, their voices carrying on the hot wind. Luke Merritt had taken a widow home, and in the Old West, nothing stirred more suspicion or more danger than a man defying the cruel rules of his neighbors. The wagon creaked as Luke Merritt guided it out of Dust Haven. The town shrank behind them, swallowed by heat and dust. Clara Hayes sat rigid on the bench beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap, her bonnet hiding her expression. For miles, neither spoke. The only sounds were the steady clop of hooves and the groan of wagon wheels rolling over ruts. Clara's throat felt dry as ash. Every bump jolted her body, reminding her she was no longer standing on that platform. But that didn't mean she was safe. Luke's presence loomed beside her. He didn't crowd her, didn't reach for her, but his silence weighed heavier than words. She stole glances from beneath her bonnet. His jaw was square, lips firm, his skin darkened by sun and wind. A man used to work, not words. His hands gripped the reins loosely, yet with a confidence that told her he could stop a runaway team if he had to. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that carried even when quiet. "You've eaten?" The question startled her. Clara blinked, fumbling for an answer. And no, not since morning. Without comment, Luke reached behind the seat, pulling a cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it in her lap. Inside, she found cornbread, a slice of cured pork, and a small jar of pickles. Ordinary food, but to Clara it looked like a feast. Her stomach clenched with hunger. "Eat," he said simply. She hesitated. Men who bought, women rarely wasted kindness. Yet his eyes stayed fixed on the road, as if her eating or not eating didn't matter to his pride. Slowly, she nibbled the bread, the taste of cornmeal almost making her weep. They rode on. The land unfolded around them, rolling hills giving way to stretches of desert grass, yucca plants reaching skyward like spindly sentinels. The sky was so wide Clara felt small beneath it. The silence pressed on her chest. At last she whispered, Why did you take me?" Luke didn't answer right away. He clicked his tongue at the horses, letting them pull the wagon up a rise before he finally spoke. A woman shouldn't be auctioned like stock. Clara's breath caught. She searched his face, but he wasn't looking at her. He was watching the horizon. "That's all," she pressed softly. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the brim of his hat. "I run a ranch. It's a hard place, lonely. You need a home. Maybe we can help each other." The words were plain, but they carried no cruelty. Still, Clara's doubts gnawed at her. Men said kind things to win trust, only to reveal their true nature later. She clutched her shawl tighter. "Will you expect me to?" She faltered, her cheeks burning. "To be a wife to you?" Luke's head turned then. His gray eyes locked on hers, steady as stone. "I expect you to rest. Eat. Find your strength again. What happens after? That'll be your choice." Clara's mouth went dry. Choice. She had not heard that word in months. They rode on, silence stretching between them again, but it was a softer silence now. The sun sank lower, painting the land in streaks of gold and crimson. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the air. As shadows lengthened, Clara dared to study him again. The scar on his brow, the wear of his clothes, the way his shirt pulled against the strength of his shoulders. He looked every bit the part of a man who belonged to the land. Yet something in his manner felt gentle, not soft, never soft, but controlled. Still, doubt lingered. The people of Dust Haven had mocked her, spat at her name. What if this man's neighbors did the same? What if his kindness was nothing but a mask? The wagon rattled down a dry creek bed, climbing the far side. Clara braced herself, one hand gripping the bench. Without warning, Luke reached out and steadied her elbow, not rough, but firm, steadying her until the wagon leveled out. His hand lingered only a second before returning to the reins. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Night crept in slowly, the first stars pricking the vast heavens. The road narrowed, leading them into the northern hills. A coyote yipped in the distance, answered by another. Clara shivered, pulling her shawl tight. Luke glanced at her. "We'll reach the ranch before midnight. There's a spare room ready. You'll have a bed and clean sheets." Clean sheets. The words nearly undid her. She bit her lip hard, unwilling to let tears fall in front of him. The horses pressed on, hooves striking sparks against the rocky trail. The land grew wilder here, dotted with mesquite and cedar. Finally, after hours of silence, Clara whispered, "Thank you." Luke tipped his hat slightly, as if to acknowledge the words without needing more. For the first time since Daniel's death, Clara felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't trust, not yet. It wasn't safety, not fully. But it was the smallest spark of hope. And in the Old West, hope was rarer than gold. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying two strangers bound by fate, toward a ranch neither knew would soon become a battlefield of whispers, envy, and defiance. The Merritt Ranch appeared out of the night like a promise. By the time the wagon rattled into the yard, the moon had risen high, silvering the rough-hewn fences and casting long shadows across the wide pastures. Clara's eyes widened as she took in the size of it, larger than any farm she had ever known. The land stretched on, dotted with cattle that slept huddled in the grass, their shapes ghostly under the starlight. The house stood at the center, 2 stories of weathered timber with a broad porch out front. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint but steady, a sign of warmth within. Luke pulled the team to a halt and climbed down first. He extended a hand, offering to help her down. Clara hesitated. She hadn't been touched with gentleness since Daniel's passing. But Luke's hand was steady, palm open, waiting. Slowly, she placed her gloved fingers in his, and he helped her down as though she were made of porcelain. Inside, the house smelled of cedar wood, leather, and faintly of tobacco smoke. The furniture was simple but solid. A long table scarred with years of meals, a stone hearth with fire glowing low, and shelves lined with tools, ledgers, and a few worn books. It wasn't a grand home, but it carried a weight of permanence. This was a place built to last. Luke gestured toward a narrow staircase. "Upstairs, last door on the right. Room's yours. Sheets are clean. You'll find a basin and pitcher for washing." Clara blinked, unsure. "My own room." He nodded, unbuckling his gun belt and hanging it by the door. "You've had enough taken from you. This is your space. Rest." Her throat tightened. She managed a quiet, "Thank you." Then she carried her bundle up the stairs. The room was small but tidy, a bed with a quilt neatly folded, a washstand, a single window overlooking the pasture. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her body sagging with exhaustion, and for the first time in months, tears spilled freely. Not from fear, from relief. The following days unfolded like a dream she didn't quite trust. Clara woke to sunlight spilling through the window, the sound of roosters crowing, and the smell of coffee drifting from below. Luke was already gone to the pastures, leaving her to explore. She found dresses folded in a trunk, simple cotton but whole and unstained. On the table downstairs, fresh bread and butter waited with a note scrawled in a rough hand. "Eat first. Chores after." She ate, still wary, then busied herself. It felt strange to work in a house again, to sweep floors, wash linens, and mend clothes. But each task grounded her, reminding her she was not a cast-off in Dust Haven anymore. She was needed here. By the week's end, she had found a rhythm. She learned where the hens nested, how to keep the firewood stacked, and even helped mend a broken fence rail while Luke steadied the post. When she tugged too hard and nearly lost her balance, his arm shot out to catch her. She flushed scarlet, pulling back, but his only response was a faint nod. No smirk, no leering comment. Just quiet steadiness. At night, Clara sometimes sat by the hearth while Luke read a ledger by lamplight. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cruel silence of loneliness. It was companionable. She found herself glancing at him more often, studying the way firelight played across his features. Strong, rugged, but also marked by weariness, as though the world had demanded too much of him. And yet, beneath it, she sensed something else, something softer. The town, however, was less kind. When Luke rode in for supplies, Clara sometimes went along, sitting stiffly in the wagon. Whispers followed them like shadows. There goes Merritt with his charity case. Bought her right off the block. She must be desperate, or he is. Clara kept her gaze low, but each word pierced her. In the mercantile, women she once knew turned their backs. Some even pulled their daughters closer, as though Clara carried shame like a disease. One afternoon, as she loaded flour into the wagon, she overheard two ranchers chuckling nearby. "Bet he took her for less than a horse," one sneered. "Hope she's worth the trouble," the other laughed. Clara's cheeks burned. She wanted to shrink into the earth. But when Luke appeared, carrying a sack of feed across his shoulder, he looked straight at the men. His voice was even, but his words cut like a blade. "Say it louder." The rancher stiffened. Neither met his gaze. They muttered curses and slunk away. Clara's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in so long: protection. Still, the whispers continued. At church, she felt the stares. At the well, she heard the snickers. The town had decided she was unworthy, and Luke was a fool for giving her shelter. Back at the ranch, Clara tried to hide her tears, but Luke noticed. One evening, as she stood on the porch staring into the distance, he joined her. For a long while, neither spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "Don't let them break you. Dust Haven's always been full of cowards who can't see past their own fences." She looked at him, startled. "But don't you care what they say about you? About us?" Luke's jaw tightened, his eyes on the horizon. "I care about the land I keep, the cattle I raise, the people under my roof. The rest, noise in the wind." His words settled in her chest like a weight she wanted to believe. Maybe she could. And so, Clara's new beginning was not filled with peace, not yet. But in the cracks of cruelty left behind by Dust Haven, she found flickers of something fragile and precious. Safety, respect, perhaps even the first stirrings of affection for the man who had lifted her from the auction block and placed her on the uncertain road toward a different kind of life. The land was harsh, the people harsher, but within the walls of the Merritt Ranch, Clara felt something she hadn't dared in a long time: hope. What she didn't know was that the whispers and envy of neighbors would soon become more than insults. They would turn into threats, testing the fragile bond between her and Luke, and forcing both to decide just how much they were willing to fight for this new beginning. Summer rolled heavy across the northern hills. Days burned hot, nights cooled just enough for a body to breathe, and the ranch carried on with the rhythm of work, mending fences, branding calves, tending to the land that never seemed satisfied. To an outsider, life at the Merritt Ranch might have seemed steady, even peaceful. But beneath the surface, a darker current was stirring. It began with whispers. At the general store, Luke heard men talking low when they thought he wasn't listening. At the churchyard, Clara felt eyes on her back like knives. Whenever they rode into town together, the air grew thick with mutters and sideways glances. "She's nothing but a burden," someone said once. He bought himself shame, not a wife. Mark my words, trouble follow them. Luke didn't answer the whispers with words. He kept his head high, his stride steady. But Clara saw the tension in his shoulders each time, the way his jaw clenched until a muscle twitched. At night, when the lamps burned low, Clara sometimes asked, "Why do they hate us so?" Luke's answer was always the same, spoken with that slow, steady certainty of his. "They don't hate us, Clara. They hate anything they can't control." But she wasn't so sure. The first true sign of trouble came one morning when Clara went to fetch eggs from the henhouse. She found the door swinging open, feathers scattered across the yard. Several hens were gone. At first, she thought it might have been a fox, but the lock had been pried loose with a tool, not claws. When she told Luke, he only nodded, his gray eyes hardening. It's not varmints. It's men. That evening, he fixed the door himself, reinforcing it with iron. But Clara noticed how he also checked the rifle by the door before bed, how his gaze lingered longer on the dark horizon before drawing the curtains closed. A week later, a fence line was cut clean through, the cattle scattered into the brush. Luke and Clara spent 2 days driving them back, both blistered by the sun, exhausted and sore. She wanted to believe it was bad luck. But when they found the tracks of horses near the break, Clara's stomach sank. The neighbors weren't content with whispers anymore. They wanted to push Luke out, or worse. The tension grew heavier between them. Clara felt it pressing in like a storm. She wanted to ask him what he would do, how he planned to fight men who hid behind shadows. But she feared the answer. Luke was strong, yes, but he was only one man. And the families who resented him, the Rileys, the Kavanaghs, the Dempseys, were many. One night, unable to sleep, Clara crept downstairs. She found Luke sitting by the cold fireplace, elbows braced on his knees, staring at the floor. "You should rest," she said softly. His head lifted. Even in the dim glow of the dying embers, she saw the weariness in his eyes. "Can't rest when I don't know what's coming." Clara's hands twisted in her shawl. "Luke, they'll hurt you. They'll hurt us. I don't know if I can stand it again. Losing someone." He rose, crossing the space in 2 strides. His hands, rough and calloused, came to rest lightly on her shoulders. Not to restrain, not to command, only to steady. "You won't lose me, Clara," he said, his voice low, firm. "Not without a fight." Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. For months she had drifted like a ghost, but in that moment, anchored by his presence, she felt alive again. Still, fear gnawed at her. The threats grew bolder. One morning, Clara stepped outside and froze. Nailed to the front gate was a note scrawled in black charcoal. "Leave Merritt Land or be driven off. Last warning." The words bled into the wood like poison. Clara's hands shook as she tore it down. When she showed Luke, he read it without flinching, then tossed it into the fire. "Let them write what they want," he muttered. But she saw the way he checked the rifle again that night, the way he left his boots by the door in case he had to rise quickly. And then came the barn. It was late afternoon when Clara noticed smoke curling against the horizon. Panic surged. She and Luke ran, and what they found turned her blood cold. The barn doors hacked open, several cattle driven off into the hills. The straw inside was blackened, a torch tossed and stamped out before it could catch fully. Luke's fists clenched, his knuckles white. He stood there a long moment, chest rising and falling like a storm barely contained. Clara thought he might march straight into town and confront them all. But instead, he knelt and pressed a hand against the scorched earth. "They want me angry," he said at last. "They want me reckless. That's how men like them win." Clara swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" He looked up at her, his eyes steady even in the face of betrayal. "We stand. Same as we always have." But Clara knew things would not stay the same. Shadows had gathered around the ranch, and each day they crept closer. She lay awake at night, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, wondering if it carried the footsteps of men with torches and guns. She had thought she left the worst behind on the auction block. Now, watching Luke prepare silently for a fight they had not asked for, she realized their real battle had only just begun. The night was too still. Clara had learned the sounds of the ranch, the low rustle of cattle, the distant yip of coyotes, the steady creak of wood in the wind. But that night, as the moon hung low and pale over the northern hills, the silence felt heavy, like a held breath. She sat upright in bed, listening, the quilt clutched tight around her shoulders. Downstairs, she heard the faint scrape of a chair against the floor. Luke hadn't gone to bed. He hadn't slept much in weeks. Each night he kept watch, a rifle propped within arm's reach, eyes always drifting toward the horizon. Clara slipped from her bed and padded down the stairs. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet, and Luke's head lifted instantly. He was sitting by the window, hat brim low, shotgun laid across his knees. "You should be resting," he said. His voice was calm, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "I can't," Clara whispered. "It feels wrong tonight." Luke's eyes narrowed slightly. He turned back to the window, scanning the darkness. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then, faintly, carried on the breeze, came the sound of hooves. Many hooves. Clara's breath caught. Luke rose in one swift motion, strapping his gun belt around his waist. Stay inside. If they come through the door, you run for the back. No, Clara said before she could think. Fear tightened her chest, but her voice was steady. I won't hide while you fight alone. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. His, hard as iron, hers burning with resolve. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. Stay close. Do as I say. Outside, shadows moved at the edge of the pasture. Torches flared to life, carried by riders who fanned out like wolves circling prey. The flicker of firelight revealed masked faces, bandanas pulled high. A dozen men at least. The leader's voice rang out across the yard, mocking and cruel. Merritt, you were warned. Time's up. Luke stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. This is my land, he called back, his voice carrying clear and strong. You've no claim here. Leave while you can still ride. The men laughed. A torch arced through the air, landing against the side of the barn. Flames licked hungrily at the dry wood. Clara gasped. Without thinking, she seized a bucket and sprinted toward the well. Luke fired his rifle, the crack splitting the night. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his horse. The others roared, charging forward. The yard erupted in chaos. Clara dashed back, sloshing water over the barn wall, beating at the flames with her shawl. Sparks flew, singeing her hands, smoke burning her lungs. Behind her, the thunder of hooves shook the earth as Luke fired again and again, each shot measured, steady. A rider fell, another horse reared, screaming. But the raiders were many. Gunfire lit the night like lightning, bullets splintering the porch rails. Luke ducked, returning fire with deadly precision. Clara dropped the bucket, coughing, eyes stinging, and saw one of the masked men rushing toward her with a torch raised high. Terror rooted her feet, until Luke's voice cut through the smoke. Clara down. She dropped to the ground. Luke's rifle roared. The man crumpled, his torch falling harmlessly into the dirt. Clara scrambled to her knees, heart hammering. She seized another bucket, racing back to the well. Her dress tore on a splintered board, but she hardly noticed. All she knew was the fire had to be beaten back. If they lost the barn, they lost everything. Another shot cracked. Another scream. The air stank of gunpowder and smoke. The raiders circled, yelling curses, trying to break Luke's defense. But the rancher stood like stone, his broad frame silhouetted against the firelight, each movement controlled, relentless. Clara threw water again and again, her arms burning, her lungs heaving. When at last the flames hissed low and died, she staggered back, shaking with exhaustion. Her hands were blistered, her shawl blackened, but the barn still stood. Suddenly, the pounding of hooves receded. The raiders, realizing they could not break Merritt, pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. One shouted, "This ain't over, Merritt," before disappearing into the night. Silence fell, broken only by Clara's ragged breaths and the crackle of dying embers. Luke lowered his rifle slowly, his chest rising and falling. He scanned the darkness, ensuring they were gone, then turned to Clara. She stood swaying, her hair loose, her dress torn, soot streaking her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. The night was heavy with the smell of smoke and blood. Then Luke crossed the yard, his hands steady as he gripped her shoulders. His eyes, fierce in battle, softened as they met hers. "You stood your ground," he said quietly. Clara's throat tightened. I thought I'd lose you." "You won't," he murmured. "Not tonight. Not while I breathe." The words sank deep, warmer than the fire that had nearly consumed them. Clara realized her fear had changed. It was no longer fear of Luke, or even of being unwanted. It was fear of losing him, the man who had stood unyielding against the storm with her at his side. She leaned into him then, just for a moment, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Luke's arms closed around her, strong and sure, holding her against the beating of his heart. The battle was over for now, but both knew the war was only beginning. The dawn broke pale and gray. a weary sun rising over smoke-streaked hills. Clara stood on the porch, shawl draped around her shoulders, staring at the blackened boards of the barn. Though the fire had been beaten back, charred scars remained, dark reminders of the night that nearly ended them both. Her hands ached from blisters, her body sore from exhaustion, yet her eyes stayed fixed on the land. Beyond the fences, the pastures rolled wide and green, the cattle still grazing as though nothing had happened. But Clara knew better. Trouble lingered in the air like the smell of burned wood. Behind her, the door creaked. Luke stepped out, moving slow. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with blood where a bullet had grazed him. His face was drawn, stubble rough along his jaw. But his eyes, steady, blue, unyielding, were alive. "You should be resting," Clara whispered, repeating the words he had spoken to her only hours before. Luke's gaze traveled the yard, the fences, the barn. His jaw tightened. Rest comes when the land's safe. And it ain't safe yet. Clara followed his eyes. The ground was scarred where horses had churned the dirt, dark stains marking where men had fallen. The well bucket still lay overturned, its rope frayed from her desperate hands. She shivered. "They'll come back." "Yes," Luke said simply. "But next time, we'll be ready." By mid-morning, the news had spread. Neighbors trickled in, some offering help, others coming only to see the damage. Mr. Carson from the North Ridge rode up, tipping his hat politely to Clara. But his eyes carried little warmth. "Word is you put 3 men in the ground last night," he said to Luke. "That kind of blood don't wash easy." Luke stood tall, his expression unreadable. "They came here to burn my home, Carson. I didn't invite him." Carson spat into the dirt, glancing at Clara. "Still, folks will say what they say. You bought a woman at auction. You fired on men most reckon belong to the county's strongest ranch. That makes enemies." Clara stiffened at his words. Heat rose to her cheeks. He defended his land. "And me," she said sharply. "Would you have done less for your wife, Mr. Carson?" Carson's mouth twisted. He tugged his reins, muttering, "Don't say I didn't warn you." Then he turned his horse and rode off, dust curling in the wake of his departure. Clara's hands balled into fists. Luke glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've got fire, Clara." She flushed, caught between pride and embarrassment. "I just don't like seeing you treated unfairly." Luke's eyes softened. For a moment, the stern lines of his face eased. "You're the only one who doesn't." As the day wore on, they worked side by side. Clara bandaged Luke's shoulder, her fingers careful as she cleaned the wound. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his body taut with restrained strength. She tried to focus on the task, but her heart thudded too loudly in her chest. "Does it hurt much?" she asked softly. Luke's lips twitched. "Feels worse when you fuss." Her eyes shot up, startled, until she caught the flicker of teasing in his gaze. Clara laughed. Unexpected, shaky, but real. The sound seemed to surprise them both. Later, they hauled charred boards from the barn, hammering new planks into place. Clara's muscles ached, but she refused to quit. Luke worked beside her, silent but steady, and together they rebuilt what the raiders had tried to destroy. By evening, the barn stood patched, the animals calm again in their stalls. Clara brushed soot from her dress, sweat streaking her brow. Luke leaned on his hammer, studying her with quiet admiration. "You don't scare easy," he said at last. "I was terrified," Clara admitted. Her voice trembled. "But I wasn't about to let fear take everything we've worked for. This place, it's my home now, too." Something shifted in Luke's expression. A shadow of loneliness lifted, replaced by a flicker of something gentler. Hope, perhaps, or longing. He nodded once, as though sealing a pact. "Then we'll fight for it together." That night, as the ranch fell into silence, Clara lay awake in her bed, staring at the rafters. Her body was weary, but her mind raced. She remembered the heat of Luke's arms around her after the fight, the steadiness of his voice, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. She had come here as nothing but property, sold like a cow at market, bound to a stranger by desperate circumstance. But now something was changing. The fear that once gnawed at her was giving way to something else, something she didn't yet dare name. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of smoke and new beginnings. And Clara knew, whatever battles lay ahead, she and Luke were no longer two strangers bound by necessity. They were becoming something stronger, something that even fire and iron could not break. The weeks that followed the raid carved deep lines into Luke's face. Clara saw them each morning as the light spilled across the kitchen table, tracing the weariness etched into his skin. He barely slept, barely smiled, his eyes always watching the ridgeline for riders that might come in the night. Clara felt the weight too. Every time she walked into town, whispers followed. Women hushed one another as she passed. Men tipped their hats stiffly, their eyes lingering too long, too sharp. At the mercantile, she overheard two farmers muttering near the barrel of flour. "Bought her like stock," one said. "Reckon he thinks he's better than the rest of us. Shooting men like that." Clara clutched her basket tighter, her cheeks burning. For a moment, she wanted to turn and shout, to tell them what it felt like to fight for your life with fire at your back and gunfire in your ears. But she pressed her lips together and walked out, spine stiff. When she returned, Luke was repairing the corral. She told him what she had heard, expecting him to rage. Instead, he just tightened the wire with steady hands. "Let them talk," he said. "Words don't break fences. Men do. And men already tried." Clara studied him, frustration warring with admiration. He bore it all so quietly, as though he were a mountain weathering a storm. Yet even mountains could crumble if battered long enough. One evening, as the sun bled red across the prairie, Sheriff Mather rode up. He was a thick-set man with weary eyes and a voice that carried authority born of compromise. "Merritt," the sheriff said, dismounting, "the town council's restless. 3 ranchers petition me to strip you of your grazing rights. They say you're stirring trouble. They're not wrong." Luke's jaw hardened. "I defended my land, Sheriff. You'd have done the same." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Clara, standing in the doorway. His voice softened, but not kindly. "And you brought a widow into it. Folks don't look kindly on what they don't understand. My advice, sell and move on before blood runs thicker." Clara felt anger rise hot in her chest. She stepped forward. "And leave everything we've built? Abandon the land we've fought for?" The sheriff sighed, mounting again. "I'm trying to keep peace, ma'am. But if another fight comes, I won't be able to hold the law on your side." Dust rose behind his horse as he rode off. Luke turned slowly, meeting Clara's eyes. She saw the battle there, not just against neighbors, but against himself. He wanted to protect her, yet he couldn't protect her from whispers, from prejudice, from the growing storm. "Maybe he's right," Luke said quietly. "Maybe you'd be safer away from me." Clara's breath caught. Fear shot through her, not of their enemies, but of the thought of leaving him. "No," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare send me away. I didn't come here for safety. I came because I had nowhere else. And now this is where I belong. With you." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Luke's chest rose and fell, his hands curling into fists. Then he let out a long breath, his shoulders easing. "Stubborn woman," he murmured. But there was no anger in his voice. Only something softer, something that made Clara's heart stumble in her chest. The neighbors grew bolder. Cattle were driven off in the night, fences cut, a water trough smashed. Each act of sabotage left Clara trembling with fury and fear. Luke fought back in the only way he knew, repairing, rebuilding, never yielding an inch. But one night, when a lantern smashed against their front porch and flames licked at the siding, Luke's restraint snapped. He charged into town the next morning, Clara riding at his side. They strode into the saloon, silence falling as every eye turned. Luke's voice rang out, iron hard. "Whoever comes onto my land again, whoever tries to burn, steal, or kill, won't leave standing. I'll defend what's mine until my last breath." A murmur rippled through the room. Men shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others smirked, daring him. Clara stood tall beside him, her hand brushing his arm. She felt his muscles taut beneath her touch, like a bowstring ready to snap. And though her heart pounded, she found herself proud to stand beside the man everyone feared, because she had seen the truth behind his steel. That night, back at the ranch, the air was thick with tension. Clara worked silently by lamplight, mending a torn shirt. Luke paced, restless. Finally, he stopped, staring down at her. "You don't have to stay in this fight, Clara," he said, his voice low. "You deserve peace. I can't give you that." Clara set down her needle, meeting his gaze steadily. "Peace isn't what I want. Not if it means leaving you." The words hung between them. Luke's eyes softened, the guarded walls around him cracking. He stepped closer, rough hands reaching for hers. Her fingers slipped into his, small and trembling, but unyielding. "Then whatever comes," he said, his voice hoarse, "we face it together." Clara's throat tightened. Tears threatened, but she held them back. Instead, she squeezed his hands, her heart pounding with something deeper than fear, something dangerously close to love. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, the promise of another storm. But inside, standing hand in hand, Clara and Luke were no longer two souls thrown together by chance. They were partners in a war that was no longer just about land. It was about belonging, about survival, about each other. And they both knew the real battle was yet to come. The storm came at midnight. Not of rain, but of men. Clara woke to the sound of hooves pounding the earth, the tremor shaking the walls of the small ranch house. Luke was already at the window, his rifle in hand, his face grim and set. Moonlight revealed a line of riders cresting the ridge, more than before, twice as many at least. Torches burned in their hands, fire flickering against steel. Clara's heart lurched. "Luke." He turned, his voice sharp but calm. "Stay low. Do as we planned." For days they had prepared, digging shallow trenches, stacking barrels of water, reinforcing the barn walls. Luke had set snares near the fence line, hidden ammunition within reach. He had known they would come, and now they were here. The riders thundered closer, their voices carrying across the night. "Merritt, this ends tonight." Luke stepped onto the porch, rifle leveled, the weight of defiance in his stance. Clara crouched behind the doorframe, clutching her shotgun with trembling hands. Her body shook, but her spirit did not. The first torch arced through the air. It landed short, doused in one of the trenches Luke had filled with water. The men cursed, charging. Gunfire split the night, the ranch yard exploding in chaos. Luke fired, steady and deliberate. A rider dropped. Another horse reared, throwing its man. Clara gritted her teeth and pulled her trigger. The shotgun boomed, kicking hard against her shoulder. A figure toppled into the dirt. Her hands trembled, but she reloaded, jaw set. The fight was furious, louder and closer than the last. Bullets chewed through wood, glass shattered. Smoke stung her lungs, but Clara kept her ground. She thought of the whispers in town, the sneers, the sheriff's warning. None of it mattered now. All that mattered was this home, this man beside her, this life she had claimed. And she would not give it up. The battle raged until the air was thick with smoke and blood. The attackers, though many, faltered against the stubborn defense. Luke fought like a man with nothing left to lose, his frame broad and unyielding. Clara, though terrified, matched him with her courage, moving where he needed her, reloading, hauling water, firing when she had to. At last, a voice cut through the din enough. A tall man rode forward, the rival rancher, Harlan Kane, his face twisted with fury. He glared at Luke, torchlight painting his features hard. "You think you can defy me, Merritt? You think you can spit in the face of this county and live?" Luke stepped into the open, rifle lowered but ready. "You came here to burn me out, Kane, but you'll leave knowing I won't bend." Kane sneered. "One man against the will of all your neighbors? You'll be crushed." Luke's voice was steady, cold as steel. "One man with a reason to fight is worth more than a dozen cowards hiding behind fire and fear." Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice rang clear, trembling but strong. "And he's not alone." Every head turned toward her. She stood in the doorway, soot streaking her face, hair wild, shotgun in her grip. She looked nothing like the widow who had once been sold at auction. She looked like a woman who had found her place and would fight to keep it. Kane's sneer faltered. His men, bruised and bloodied, shifted uneasily. None of them had expected such resistance. Not from Merritt, not from a woman who should have been broken. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Kane spat into the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled. He wheeled his horse, signaling the retreat. One by one, the riders pulled back, disappearing into the night. The yard fell silent, save for the crackle of dying flames and the ragged breaths of the defenders. Clara sagged against the doorframe, her shotgun slipping from her hands. Luke caught her before she fell, his arms strong around her. For a moment, they stood in the smoke and ruin, clinging to each other as the world stilled. Dawn broke over a battered ranch. The fences were scarred, the windows shattered, the barn pitted with bullet holes. But the house still stood. The land was theirs. As the sun rose, a few neighbors appeared, silent, cautious. They had heard the fight. They had expected to find ruin. Instead, they found Luke and Clara standing together, unbroken. Carson, the North Ridge rancher, dismounted slowly. He studied the couple, then tipped his hat. "Didn't think you'd hold him off," he admitted. "Maybe we misjudged you." Luke said nothing. But Clara stepped forward, her voice clear. "We're not leaving. This land is ours, and no amount of fire or bullets will change that." Carson nodded once. And for the first time, the whispers of the county began to shift. That night, when the ranch was quiet and the danger had ebbed, Clara found Luke on the porch. He was staring at the horizon, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. She touched his arm gently. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not over, but maybe different." She leaned against him, her hand slipping into his. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Luke turned to her then, his eyes searching hers. The walls he had built, stone by stone, cracked wide open. "You're more than I ever expected, Clara," he said hoarsely. "More than I deserved." Her breath caught, and in the silence of the night, with smoke still clinging to the air, he bent and kissed her. Fierce, unguarded, a vow sealed in fire and blood. Clara clung to him, her heart soaring. For the first time since the auction block, she felt not like property, not like a burden, but like a woman cherished. Together, they had fought. Together, they had endured. And together, they would build a life no one could take. The ranch bore scars, as did they both. But in the quiet after the storm, as the stars stretched endless above them, Clara knew one truth above all others. They were no longer strangers bound by chance. They were a home, forged in fire,